Can you take the time and give my good a round of applause, please? Make it sound good about. I'm going to say you about such. You know, so nothing wrong with the accent. Booyaka, Brother Daniels. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. Now, I don't care whether it's one or two of us. I know that our people them is very lively. And when it's two or three of us, we can make we feel nice with one another when we're here. So when we say good evening, I want to feel nice. So I will say it again. Good evening. Good evening. That makes me feel a little bit better. Feel a little bit better. Now, once again, we're here for the African History Month. And I want to thank you for coming out, and especially the young people, I want to thank you for coming out this evening to make this evening what it is. And so, all of you that have made the time, I hope that you all enjoy this evening in what we've got to talk about. Last week, we were covering the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we touched a bit into the 80s. And the previous week before that, we was looking at the African experience and within the whole World War I, World War II, and the Berlin Conference of 1885, and how that also had an impact on bringing about what we call the First and Second World War. So today, we're now going to look at the 80s right through until 2014. Now that time period for me is a very interesting time period. Many of the young people might just have been born in 1990, some of you 2000. But this particular aspect of the journey also involves yourselves. And so one of the things I first want to do is give thanks to our parents who came here being told that the streets were paved with gold and that they could come here and do great things. And so our parents have come here and have done great things and have left a massive legacy in many, many ways for us to then pick up and continue to keep going forward. But it's also to remember and celebrate our time too, because we exist. So while celebrating World War I, World War II, and what our ancestors did, and the roles that they played in those things, it's also for us to really celebrate our parents and celebrate us, because we're part and parcel of the same journey. So I'm hoping that tonight we'll get a sense of what the 80s were like coming right through to 2014. And I call that particular time a lot of resistance. There's a lot of resistance. So let's take a look at what was going on round about that particular time period. We're talking about the 1980s, and we're speaking about the New Cross Fire. And now, that New Cross Fire was really a serious thing. And I grew up with a lot of those young people that went to school at that time. Many of those young people were my friends. And some of those young people were giants in themselves, whose time was cut short because they could have really added some great value to the world today had they been here. And so these are some of the journeys that we've been through, but these were some of the people who I grew up with. And at this particular time, the 80s, we were still dealing with National Front in a lot of ways. The National Front were chasing us here, chasing us there. Not too far from here, you had Bermondsey down the road. If you made a mistake or find yourself in the wrong part of Bermondsey at the wrong time of night, you might find yourself in a real particular pickle. And you might be in a pickle for real. That's what it used to be like down these particular sides. Deptford wasn't an easy place either. So there's a rich history which is part and parcel of our journey. So at this time, as I said, due to the nature of National Front and what was taking place at this particular time in the 80s. These are the things that was taking place and happening. So let's have a listen to what was going on at the time of the 1980s. So buckle up your seatbelts. We're going to go on a little journey, and I hope you enjoy the ride. It might get a little bit bumpy from time to time, but there's always a little bit turbulence when we're flying. So just strap yourself in the seats, and we'll bring you back in due course, safe and sound.
No one was ever charged with starting the fire, and the case would never be solved. But the episode had raised the bitterness in the black community to a new pitch.
Nobody in any official position had begun to understand what had happened in the black community.
This man, he had no money to bury his child. So we went to the undertakers. And I rang the bank manager and I said to him, we haven't got any money in the bank, but could we arrange a funeral? And he said, it's all right, Mrs. Phoenix. I understand, don't bother about it. Arrange the funeral. So I wrote the check from my husband's checkbook for the first 2 funerals.
The people that were involved are the civil phoenixes. I mean, civil phoenixes are... nobody couldn't tell me civil phoenix is not an angel sent down from heaven to help. These people helped, and they helped a lot. But they couldn't do it all. Where was the help?
The local community's feeling of isolation was focused by one extraordinary omission. Customarily, when such a tragedy occurs, a letter of condolence is sent by the Queen. No such letter was ever received.
I think it was a sign that in our attitudes, and I say our, I mean the CRE, in government, in Buckingham Palace, weren't fully sort of on a wavelength with the multiracial community, and didn't instinctively feel, well, this is awful, this is a national disaster, whether it's black people who died or not, we must take the proper action.
What heightened, in contrast, of course, is that only a few days after the fire, in which these black people had died, there was fire in Dublin, I think it was. And immediately, you see, there were messages of condolence from officials and authorities in this country, and no one had said anything to the parents of these children.
The Prime Minister, the Queen, and everybody, they were in Ireland, fast, sending their condolences to families of people that had died and been injured and whatever not. And no one ever came down to see us. No one ever picked up the phone to say, well, how are you? How are the children? What happened? Whatever not. It didn't matter. We didn't matter. We weren't even an afterthought, because you would have thought that after going to Ireland, somebody would have said to them, well, hey, what about the kids down in New Cross? We wasn't even an afterthought because nobody came to see us. Nobody mentioned anything about us.
The anger and despair of the black community was to culminate in an unprecedented event. A protest march of black people from the scene of the fire into the heart of the capital.
It was important for us to bring London to a standstill, to say, we're here. Look at us, we're here, we're hurting, and you're not doing anything about it. You're pretending it hasn't happened.
We wanted to show solidarity with the families. We wanted to demonstrate that this is something important to our community. It was something we had to do, and so we marched.
As the protesters assembled on the morning of March the 2nd, the only question was just how many would answer the call.
I remember getting there early and thinking, not knowing how many people there were going to be there, that was the first thing, wondering how many people would come. And being, I suppose, as we set off, pleased but also a little disappointed that there weren't more people. And thinking, well, you know, I wonder how this will go.
It was quite a modest beginning. There was about 2,000 or 3,000 people. But all along the march, we kept on picking up more people, more people. By the time we reached Camberwell, we must have had about 5,000, 6,000 people. School children were climbing over fences to come and join the demonstration in Peckham.
All the kids were jumping over the fences and like it was awesome. It was just amazing to sort of like be there and see that many people. I never realised how many people actually sort of like, you know, was in support of us until I saw them all scaling these fences basically and sort of like joining in the march, and that was a real sort of like, it was touching.
Then you saw waves and waves and waves and waves and waves and waves and waves of black people coming down that hill. It was like the charge of the light brigade, I tell you.
We saw black people leaving their offices, running out, grabbing their coats. It wasn't planned. Many of them lost their jobs in order to support the day of action as it was. And I felt good to know that people was doing so.
By the time the march entered the centre of London, over 15,000 people had massed on the streets, far surpassing all expectations.
It was thought that people wouldn't come from all over the country, for instance, and descend upon Deptford and then be prepared to march in hundreds and thousands through the streets of London. We were quite wrong, of course, about that, and I think we probably underestimated the strength of feeling that there was in the wider black community.
I think even the black community itself was surprised that it had so much power to mobilize so many people, because people came from Leeds, from Bradford, from Huddersfield, from Derby, from Manchester, from as far as Scotland. People came down for this demonstration. People came from all over the country.
Britain's black communities had come together as never before. The old and the young joined in a common cause.
The wonderful thing was that feeling of solidarity and to look around and see these older people trudging along, obviously quite tired, really, footsore, but nonetheless trudging along. And it was the youngsters who kept up the chant, you know, 13 dead, nothing said. What do you want? Justice. When do you want it? Now.
A lot of youths wanted to do some bad things to people. I mean, we had to restrain a lot of people on the march, because people were so angry, people were so bitter. Not just about what happened, but about the way the whole business was handled by the police and the way it was reported in the press and the media. That is what caused the bitterness, really.
I can remember walking up Fleet Street, looking up at the people leaning out of the Daily Telegraph building, and I remember the noise echoing in between the buildings.
When we reached Fleet Street, there was a torrent of abuse from the Sun, from the windows of the Sun newspaper and other. I don't know if it was the Express. But definitely, people working in the offices of the Sun newspaper shouted nothing but racial abuse at the demonstration. Go back home, you black bastards, and the usual banal kind of things that these people say,
With the young people, and the more you looked at them, the more you realized they could have been killed in that and nobody would care. I think it's the lack of care that kept me going.
It wasn't just about the fire, it wasn't just about the people that died, the people that were injured in it. It was about people's underlying feelings from way back when, from the troubles up in Notting Hill and whatever, not that my mum and my dad used to tell me about. Things have built up and built up over a period of time, over years, all different things that have happened, and nothing had ever come to. Black people, we've never come together in such a great force to say, something's got to be done. This has got to stop.
I remember walking through the West End later and being pleased at that point that nothing had come out of the day which could undermine the seriousness and dignity of our purpose. That was very important.
The demonstration had passed off largely without incident, but when it came to the reporting of the march, a rather different story would be told.
I was interviewed and I thought, okay, this is a moment of triumph. It's time to be modest. They said, Mr. what do you think of the demonstration? I said it was a good day. The following day in the Evening Standard, police officer front ridge, blood streaking down his face, dark as upstairs. It's a good day.
In an isolated incident of which few marchers were even aware, a small group of men had ransacked a jeweler's shop. While attempting to arrest the looters, a policeman was injured. The image of the fallen officer was used to characterize the entire demonstration.
From that, then, I thought we could only draw this fight. You can't win it. Because they were coming back like thunder.
I remember getting the newspapers the following day and seeing that it was, black mob rampage through West End kind of thing. We were, I think, deeply disappointed that the justice in our claim and that the tragedy itself was still considered to be secondary to the sort of sensation.
But the march had achieved one aim. The fire had made it onto the national agenda.
I want to say to, especially the young people, that was a very tough time we were living in at that time. It wasn't an easy time during the 80s, but that's where we came together and mass mobilized because of the lives of 13 young people who had lost their life. And that's why it's important for us to talk about and celebrate and share the history. Because when we don't celebrate and share the history, we can actually lose the history and it just becomes something that was of the past but don't have nothing of the present. And the reason why I'm saying about that is because the same way media was then is the same way media is today in the way the media looks at things. And so that was a very tough time during that particular period. And that was 1981. 1981 was a hot time. And it got even hotter later on that year. When the Brixton Uprising of 1985 started on the 28th of September in Lambeth, South London, it was the second major riot in the area, witnessed in the space of 4 years. And the last one, in 1981, was sparked due to the shooting of Cherry Gross. And those who can remember Cherry Gross, who got shot at Brixton, it caused mayhem. And it was a really tough time for us as young people growing up because the police didn't make it easy and society itself wasn't easy. So this was what was taking place at this particular point in time. So 1985 was a serious time for us in this country. And I'm bringing you through the decades because I think it's important.
And now we go over to Jan Leeming for a news report.
Fires are still burning in Brixton in South London after an evening of rioting. It began as a demonstration of anger after police had shot and seriously wounded a woman while searching her house. Then a crowd attacked the police station and gangs of youth began burning and looting buildings. 31 policemen and 5 civilians have been hurt. Mike Mackay has been at Brixton all evening.
This was the corner of Brixton Road and Loughborough Road 5 hours after trouble began outside the local police station. Petrol bombs rained down as riot squad police held the line behind their shields. Similar scenes were occurring all round Brixton as the disturbances spread in all directions from the Brixton police station. Fire and ambulance services trying to enter the area found many streets blocked off. At the corner of Cold Harbour Lane, a 4-storey building collapsed after being set alight by petrol bombs. The top 3 stories were flats over a furniture shop, but they were thought to be unoccupied. By this time, hundreds of firemen and scores of fire engines were dealing with burning buildings, mostly leaving blazing cars simply to burn themselves out. Throughout the night, dozens of cars were taken from their owners and turned into blazing barricades. Hundreds of shops within half a mile of Brixton Police Station were looted and wrecked.
Mike Mackay reporting. That's all from the newsroom for now.
This is when we're talking about new crossfire. After the new crossfire, we're moving into the riots, or I call it the uprising, not necessarily the riots, because our young people at that time, when we were young, we couldn't take too much of what was going on within mainstream society. And so things didn't get any easier during that time. Things got just as much as hard. And in the same year, 1985, we had what we call Cynthia Jarrett. And these things really started to trigger things off in the country. So, when we're looking at it, we're really coming to understand that these time periods were not easy. Were really not easy. But, as I said, from 1985, coming right through, really did become a tough time for us as young people growing up in this country. So as I said, you had the 1985 uprisings in Brixton, and you also had what was going on in Tottenham.
And now we go over to Jen.
Here we go, one moment. Saying, when we come from looking at celebrating what our ancestors or our parents have gone through, I'm saying to you that right through every decade leading right up to now, it's been continual struggle. It's never been something that we've got over. And so, when we move up into the 90s, we start to see Stephen Lawrence and what was taking place with Stephen Lawrence in Eltham at that time. And that wasn't an easy time, and I never lived too far from there. And Eltham wasn't a place that you went at that time just for the sake of it. But Stephen lost his life. And that then set off a whole series of things in this country at that time. And so, here we are, looking at what was going on in South East London, and what the impact of those things were in South East London.
Although the inquiry was not about finding Stephen's killers, Macpherson believed that the 5 suspects should give some account of themselves.
They were arrogant, and is that they can do whatever they like and they can get away with it because they've got away with it. And so they just didn't care. And watching them, and they had this, like a smirk on their face. And so like, you can't touch us.
The suspect supplied virtually no new information to the inquiry. But the real defendants at the inquiry were the Metropolitan Police. All aspects of their investigation were subjected to minute examination, beginning with the night of the murder. Critical was their handling at the scene of the crime of the prime witness, Stephen's friend Dwayne Brooks. One of the senior officers present was Inspector Stephen Groves.
When he arrived, he made the assumption, according to his evidence, that there had been a fight. Not that there had been a terrible murder in which young Dwayne Brooks had also been involved, but that there had been some kind of fight. And we believe that, in that sense, he stereotyped young Dwayne Brooks.
what that did in relation to Inspector Groves was to effectively close his mind to the possibility of going and searching for the real suspects, who Dwayne had said had headed down a particular road. Now, that to me shows that the racism, the race stereotyping that was in Inspector Groves' mind played a significant part in the way the investigation was handled by the police on the night in question and thereafter.
Did you see nothing?
Definitely not. This time of the night.
There was very little difficulty, I think I have to say, in establishing that things had gone wrong in the investigation. But the probing that took place during the evidential phase was aimed at undercurrents and at motive or reasons behind the failures. And it was that which, of course, particularly the Lawrence legal team was aiming to establish. And we did detect quite early on in the evidence of some of the police officers what we believed to be institutional racism.
Macpherson has said you've got to look at the totality of the way in which an institution works and see whether the effect, not the intention, but the effect of what it's doing is in some way discriminatory. And I think that has taken the definition further and is a much more difficult concept to both to demonstrate and to grapple with. But grapple with it we clearly must.
It was a moment that I never thought would ever happen.
Madam Speaker, with permission, I should like to make a statement about the report of the inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence.
The fact that we as black people has managed to have caused such a change, it was quite something.
There is no doubt that there were fundamental errors. The investigation was marred by a combination of professional incompetence, by institutional racism, and by a failure of leadership by senior officers.
And to be invited there to see it happen, that was quite something.
The report says that institutional...
This was the first and only time I have been aware of the whole House being aware of who was present in the public gallery. There was an enormous sense of occasion, of the importance of what we were doing.
So I want this report to serve as a watershed in our attitudes to racism. I want it to act as a catalyst for permanent and irrevocable change, not just across our public services, but across the whole of our society.
And this was, at that time, when you're talking about the Macpherson report, that really looked at what was going on for us here as a people. So I want to jump back just a bit in order to look at how we led up to where we led up to. And as I said, we have the Brixton riots, and this is in '85. And from the Brixton riots, as I said, we started to move into the place where we're talking about Cynthia Jarrett. And this was in '85, and Stephen Lawrence was in the '90s. So this stuff took place on the Broadwater farm and caused a big uprising. And the uprisings broke out all over London, all over in different countries, in different cities in England. Because black people, not just in London, in Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, were just about fed up with the kind of treatment that they were getting. And it was the young people who were the ones that were really standing up and saying, enough is enough. But Cynthia Jarrett, in that particular period of time of the 80s, coming in right into the 90s with Stephen Lawrence, has been a travesty that still yet to this day hasn't fully revealed the ramifications of what took place. So that's why we have Stephen at that particular period of time. And so, I want to take you past Stephen and take you to a different time. And right as we kind of came to the end and was moving through the 90s was a very funny period too. And in the 90s, different things were going on for us in our community. And we were wilding out for something needed to happen. And one of the things that came across to me at this particular point in time was coming across the Nation of Islam. And at that time, during this experience, they was also at the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and were part and parcel of what was going on. And it was just a fascinating time while they were around. They put the heebie-jeebies up people, because when people saw them, they were wondering, well, who are these people then, and where did they come from? But it fascinated me, because there was these black men who were standing up saying these kind of things, and it just really kind of gave me a whole different look on what was going on the journey at that time. So this is what was going on, and they used to be up by Hyde Park Corner, and this was some of the interesting things that they used to say when we used to go up by Hyde Park Corner and hear what they had to say.
And so, the next time you put on your news to watch the entertainment you call war, remember, there are real human beings underneath those bombs. And when you have no respect for another human being's life, see this black man here? There is not one of you here that is his superior. Not one of you. His life is as precious as yours. That's right, go ahead, man. In fact, when you will abuse another human being's life, you make yourself less than a human being, and then you forfeit the right to be treated as a human being. You become a beast, and you be treated like a beast when you think that you are superior. And so, it's a day of reckoning. It's a day of calculation. Your Bible says, count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. 6, 6, 6. And I've got to say to you, that where you thought Satan was some beast or some being under the ground, Satan is alive and well on top of the ground. Satan is a man. You didn't hear me? I said Satan is a man and God is a man. Come on. You are human beings. Almighty God Allah is the supreme being. He is the supreme of all beings. But he lives. He's alive. Don't talk to me about a dead God. My God lives. My God has power to deal with a living Satan. My God can defeat Satan. So I don't stand in Hyde Park speaking bold because I think myself to be powerful. I have no power. These people have got so much power, they could take a high-powered rifle and blow my brains out. If it's the will of God. But if it's not his will, you ain't got a gun big enough. We do not fear you. We say to the British government, we know that they're going to make a move against the Nation of Islam. You didn't hear me. They're going to make a move against the Nation of Islam. They cannot have this type of truth being spoken to the British people. And so, watch this space. But we say to the British government in the Nation of Islam, we won't run from you. We run to you. So come on and do what you got to do. So that our God can take care of you. Because we have a God behind us today. That's right. You may think God is the joke. I'm saying watch your forces in the desert. With all of your superior forces. You see the way you're getting bogged down. The Iraqis said you stretch yourself out like a snake. And they said we're going to cut up the snake. We're going to cut the snake into pieces. Watch and see. You boasted when you went into Vietnam. Little tiny Vietnam. Facing the big bully. The big bully, America. And America said, we're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age. But then you saw the Americans running falling from their helicopters to get out. You went to Mogadishu in Somalia. You said you're going to take care of General Adid. You're going to take care of those little knick-knocks in Africa. And then we saw the Americans running, trying to get out after you saw some of your soldiers dragged behind the Jeep. Oh, we'll drag you behind the Jeep. I heard one of the Iraqis call you a dog. And that's what they are. Dogs of war. That's right. That's right. Baghdad is a trap for you. Baghdad is a trap for you. And I warn you, those of you with sons and daughters or relatives in the Gulf, tell them to come home. This morning they sent home 2 British soldiers who refused to fight. They say we will not fight in a war. Yeah, let's give them a round of applause. 2. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. They sent home 2 soldiers who said we will not fight in a war where innocent men, women and children are the victims. And so now the British government are threatening them with court-martial and a possible 2 years in jail. Well, let me tell you something, that will be 2 years well spent. You must be prepared to go to jail for your conscience and for truth, freedom, justice and equality. Thank you for listening. Respect your mother. Those of you, if your mother is still alive.
And that was in the time of the 1990s. And that was where you had, in America at that same time, you had the Million Man March taking place in the United States of America. So things were warming up all over the place in the sense of our journey and our timeline to where we are now. And so when we kind of start to move forward into what we now call the 2000s, we still find that there are things coming up within our community. What I'm saying is, those of you that have been here over the last 3 weeks or so, is that there's been a chronological journey that we've been taking you through that brings you from the year 1885 right through to the year 2014. So some of you might have missed it, but there's a chronological order. And so here we are, finishing from in the 1990s, and I'm saying that when I used to hear some of those things, like what Leo Mohammed was saying here, and what the nation was doing here, it was a powerful time, certainly indeed, especially in the 80s and the 90s, because you had a lot of groups that were out there, especially NWA and Wu-Tang, and a whole lot of different various groups out there that were saying a lot of things that I thought to myself, yes, just like Public Enemy, don't believe the hype. But as we move through that time, here we are in 2009. And now we're right back to another time where we find out about a young man by the name of Mark Duggan. I'm only putting this presentation to you in the sense of, in the chronological order, you're just getting a timeline of how we've arrived to be where we're at. And so now, here we are, with this taking place at this particular point in time, and what this meant for the community.
We begin with the violence in Britain that is only getting worse.
Indeed, for the first time since the rioting and looting started over the weekend, it has spread outside London to other major British cities.
ABC's Simon McGregor-Wood joins us by phone from London. Good morning, Simon.
Good morning, that's right. Violence last night spread outside London to Birmingham, Liverpool, or isolated incidents in Bristol and other cities. At the epicentre of this sort of firestorm of rioting that remains in London. Last night it spread to some really quite affluent areas in South and West London. We saw, and you've probably seen over there, some extraordinary pictures of gangs, of hundreds of often masked youths rioting through the streets, setting shops alight. looting, widespread looting, and in many cases, according to local residents, the police either arrived too late or when they did arrive were simply unable to confront the numbers and the apparent level of organisation that the rioters are deploying. Widespread criticism from residents, as I said, politicians are cancelling their summer vacations. Prime Minister David Cameron, after some delay, has decided to come back from his vacation in Italy, and this morning he will chair a special session of an organisation called COBRA, which is an emergency committee of cabinet ministers and security chiefs to try and put a lid on what now seems to be a situation that is spiralling out of control.
Simon, let's back up for just a second for folks who are wondering why this is all happening.
Yeah, what's the motivation here?
Yeah.
Well, that's the $60,000 question. The spark for this happened on Saturday night when the police shot a young black man in Tottenham in North London. There was a vigil in his memory outside a police station on Saturday night. At some point, that vigil, which had been peaceful, was overtaken by crowds of rioting youngsters, and it spiraled from there. But no one is saying that the sort of copycat violence that we've seen in the last couple of days is anyway inspired or connected to the original incident. This seems to have sort of taken on a life of its own. And in most cases, in the majority of cases, people are just saying this is a group of criminal gangs organising themselves to loot and steal wherever possible.
So there is a level of organisation to all of this.
Well, it seems so. Much has been made in recent hours of these gangs apparently meeting by prior arrangement using Facebook and using their Blackberries and mobile phone messaging platforms. In that sense, they're staying one step ahead of the police. There are many cases which we've seen pictures of these gangs more or less ruling the streets for several hours before the police even turn up.
All right, we'll obviously keep an eye on this story as it continues to evolve. Simon Wood there in London for us. Thank you so much.
So that's you're looking at 2000, 2011. And I mean, when that thing broke out, it broke out. And I saw how some of that stuff was really taking place out on the street. And that's what I'm saying to you, out of all of this that we're seeing is a frustration of what people are going through. The fact that people don't feel as if to say things are working in a way that benefits young people, benefits society as a whole. And so, hence we find young people being ostracized, stereotyped, mocked, maligned in the media, and looked at in all different kind of ways. But we do know that the same continuation line that we're talking about is what we're talking about where we've come from and where we are now. And so even up to this day, others have died in police custody. Many others have died in police custody. But to this day, no one has been prosecuted for the deaths of young black men within inside police custody. So we're moving now to a time now where it just feels like, boy, everything is just going in a crazy direction and people are just getting confused. But in August 2014, for me, I took part in one of the greatest things that I've experienced in London for years. And for me, I was just honored to be at that place because I went to support and walk for my mum, my dad, my ancestors that couldn't walk for themselves. So I was representing them. And so this came up in August 2014. And I'm telling you, it was one of the most beautiful days and most beautiful times of my life that I've had since I've been alive. And I want you to see what was taking place and what was happening in August 2014. This took place right here in London, 2014. And fantastic it was. Revelation. I tell you, this day was a great day. And I'm telling you, I loved every minute of it. And when you see us meet up at Brixton, and we moved down from Brixton and going down through Kennington, man, it was amazing. Black people going their car road, supporting the event. It was fantastic to see. I don't think Parliament has seen anything like this in a long, long time. black man and black woman, man and child, disabled. Woman a walk with dark, woman a walk with long hair, some coming on them high pool, all kind of things for that day. And we was on one accord. Muslim, Rasta, Christian, every denomination of man from our community was there. And on that day we walked in the spirit of oneness. And I'm telling you, it was the most amazing thing. And you see, when you're traveling up towards Westminster Bridge, and you got the bridge, and we're going under the bridge to go over the bridge. And as you come up to Waterloo and you're going underneath the train station of Waterloo, and make I tell you something, when Rastaman start lick the drum, I tell you, and you want to hear this thing reverberate all underneath the bridge, I'm telling you, man, it was something to be seen. And that's why I'm saying, young people, you've got to know this history. Because this is your history. As we have stood on the shoulders of those who have come before us, so it is that you have to stand on the shoulders of us that have come before you. And not to say that our work is done, because our work ain't done. This is just 2014. The future is yet to be dealt with. But it can't be dealt with until we deal with it. And that's why I'm saying, this March, they didn't put this on TV. This weren't on TV. They weren't going to tell you, say, that one bag of black people turn up and block the whole of Brixton, and block the whole of Kennington, and block. Listen, when I tell you, say, you see when we got down to Westminster Bridge, I was in the middle. And those at the front and those at the back. When you look, going over the bridge, it was just like a sea of black people. And when you look behind you, it was another sea of black people. And you see when we got over Westminster Bridge and we bust a right to go to 10 Downing Street, I don't think they didn't know what was happening. When they see black man just land, and when we tell you the road black, nothing can move. Everything come to a standstill there, sir. It was an amazing day. And that is, I'm just saying that to say to you, sir, all from what we've been doing throughout these series of weeks in relation to our story. Because it's all one thing you're hearing someone else's story, but this is our story. And I know that each and every one of us in here have got our own stories to tell. But until we start to share our stories and tell our stories, no one will really know about our story. And so it's our duty to make sure that we celebrate our ancestors. And don't forget that the weight now is on our shoulders to make sure that we get our children through. Because from the time of 1884, right the way up through into the 1884 Berlin Conference and dividing up, leading up to First World War, Second World War, our people coming in, they working hard, sacrificing, not being respected, not being loved. Remember, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. They didn't have nowhere to go. People didn't want them in their house. Jobs. They didn't want to give them jobs. And here we come through the 60s. As I've said to you before, teddy boys, skinheads. This is all part of the journey that I've been showing you over the weeks. And it's gone right on through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Here we are in 2014. The future is yet to unfold. Next week, what I want to do is end off, and I hope you will come back next week, because if you come back next week, there's some questions that I want to ask you, but I want to show you something, because as I've said many a time, within the education system in this country, they're not going to educate the children to tell you nothing about your own history and who you are and your successes. I mean, we are such successful people, it's unbelievable. But only we can tell that story. And all I can say to you is that if you come next week, it will answer a question for you next week. And after you see what I'm going to show you, and then I'll ask you the question at the end, of what it is that you heard. After that time, the responsibility is then on you, with what you choose to do with the information that you've got, and hope that African History Month has been a success and has been interesting, and that we've gone away learning something more than we did before. So I'm finished at 2014, but next week I'm going to talk to you about the history of the world, and I'm going to talk to you about a man who has done this documentary, and this documentary is so interesting that really it should change the whole education system and the way they teach. But you've got to ask yourself the question, why hasn't it been fed down? But I'm not going to tell you what it is now. So you come back next week, and then we'll do it again, and it's going to be more interactive next week. Not me talking to you, but this time will be us talking to each other. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you once again for being so attentive and paying attention to our story, and I hope you enjoy it. There's so much more that we could talk about in relation to our story and our great achievements, but we can't do it all in one day. It takes time. You know, we mustn't come craving. You know, when we eat food, we must eat little by little. You don't just want to throw down everything on your throat all one time, and then all of a sudden you reach. It don't go like that. So, thank you again. Young people, thank you for coming, and I thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again next week, same place, same time. We're landing now, and we brought you back down to earth, and I hope you didn't have too much of a bumpy journey, and next week we're going to be flying again by Airlines Daniel, so just come next week.